Welcome again. As many of you know, Chris is the head of the director of the Holborn Museum. He's been in Bath since 2017. Before that, he was at the Tate Gallery in London for almost 21 years. And for much of that time, he was head of displays at Tate Britain and lead curator of modern British art, which is where I first met Chris, because I was a docent for over 20 years. So I used to be running around repeating what he had written to all the people coming into the gallery. His numerous exhibitions include some of Tate's most successful shows, including works with some of the most distinguished artists, such as Barbara Hepworth, which is one of his favorites, I'm sure, Francis Bacon, Henry Moore, Picasso, David Hockney. And they were all featured in some of the major exhibitions that he curated. As a leading expert on modern British art, he's published extensively on the subject, and I was particularly drawn to his work on Peter Lanyon, who's one of my favorite artists. There's something about Lanyon's line and color, which is fantastic, part of the St. Ives group, of course. And the book was called On the Edge of Landscape. Was that 2010? 2000. Republished 2010, maybe? Because I couldn't find on Google. Anyway, yeah, 2000, okay. Which led me to invite him to give a talk at the Chelsea Arts Club, because at that time I was organizing what we called was Saturday afternoon luncheons. Of course, it was a sellout, and everyone was delighted with the subject matter and with the presentation. So it is very fortunate that we have him here at the Holborn Museum and here tonight. Just as a little add-on, I'd like to introduce you to John Law, who's the co-convener of the arts program here at Brilsey, and he wants to say a few words because we met Chris earlier in the week, and John was actually a student at Corsham, and he may have known some of the artists who will be in the talk tonight. So John, would you like to say a few words?
Hello. I'd like to begin by saying I strongly support Chris's efforts to bring a little bit of modern art and design to our handsome Georgian city. Current evidence can be seen at the Holborn. There's a very interesting, I thought quite hard work, juxtaposition between Goya and Paula Rego, and there's some interesting neon on the facade and inside the gallery. Some of this evening's talk will feature artists who taught me at Corsham. That was Bath Academy of Art, possibly the best art school in the world, according to one visiting lecturer, where I was fortunate to be a student. So I look forward to this very much. Chris?
Great, thank you both so much. It's actually your introduction sort of opened up two things. Sandra mentioned that I spoke in a programme of talks she gave at that she organised at the Chelsea Arts Club, which was I remember very well, and it shows that I'm right about the timing because it was long enough that we had two projectors with old slides on carousels on with two screens, and there were two issues I remember that day. One was that we had lunch before the talk. So the Chelsea Arts Club, Saturday lunchtime is a bad idea because everyone was quite boozed up by the time I stood up to speak about Peter Lanyon and the Edge of Landscape. And even before I started, one of the screens kept blacking out. And I thought, oh, there's some technical problem. I don't know how to work a projector. And then we gradually realized that the woman sitting next to the projector was already falling asleep and her head was lolling in front of the lens. So, even if it all goes wrong from here, it can't be it can't be as bad as that. So the other thing I wanted to say is I feel supremely underqualified to do this talk about modern art in Britain. This is the third time this year I volunteered to write or speak about a subject I don't know much about. And I'm conscious that there are people in the room who certainly do know more than me, which is why I slightly tweaked the title to call it Episodes of Modern Art, which allows me to completely omit certain things without being chastised. Anyway, that made me wonder, why did I volunteer to talk about modern art in Bath? and rather than getting on with my day job. And I think there are a couple of things that sort of arise from, I suppose, frustrations that I found since I came to the Holborn in 2017. One was, I don't know whether this is an actual thing, I found it in an old file at the Holborn, whether this was actually the cross-section of the building at the time in the 1990s, I think, or whether it was a sort of idealized projection. But you'll see, I don't know if this has a little red, oh no, that's complete, oh God, I pressed the wrong thing. Okay, it's not a pointy thing. So this is a cross-section of the Holborn Museum, and you'll see on the right-hand side of the ground floor, if you can read it, the Craft Study Centre. So from 1977 to 2000, the Craft Study Centre abided at the Holborn Museum. This is an extraordinary organisation. I didn't know much about it before I arrived here. Started by Robin Tanner, a local artist who lived towards Chippenham. He was known as a member, part of the etching revival between the First and Second World Wars. I chose this slide because it's where I live. I mean, not literally in the barn, but it's in Slaughterford, near Chippenham. I live just around the corner from there. People no longer break stones on the edge of the road, I have to say. Robin Tanner was a great connoisseur of 20th century British craft and recognised that this was a rich tradition that had played an important part in modern British culture that was completely neglected by the establishment. And he started to build a collection. It was originally prompted by the collection of Baron and Larcher, the famous printed textile producers from the 1920s, whose archive had been threatened with sort of destruction or being lost, and he had salvaged it. And he built this collection working with other makers and their descendants. Printed textiles like Baron and Larcher, weavings like the work of Ethel Mary. And the greatest boost was when his friend and Ethel Mary's friend, the potter Bernard Leach, this is in the 1970s, and Leach was an old man, offered them a definitive collection of his own pots, his archive, which I realised when I was doing my research on St Ives in the early 90s, I went to consult at 99 Sydney Place, just opposite the Holborn. I have to confess, I don't remember going to the museum. But Leach offered a collection of 100 pots of his own work, his archive, which is an extraordinary repository of correspondence and notes and so on, and also his collection of his sort of reference pots, the Korean moon jars and Japanese work that he had acquired through his career as inspiration and as models for his own practice. I mean, with that gift, of course, everyone else followed suit. So you see the Craft Study Centre built a wonderful collection of Lucy Ree, Catherine Pladel-Bouverie, Michael Cardew, the great names in ceramics of that generation. And it became, in the late 70s, the most important collection of 20th century British craft, probably outside anywhere, possibly the V&A might be an exception. And it was housed at the Holborn for want of anywhere else to go, at a time the Holborn was run by the University of Bath. And in time, not unnaturally, bearing in mind this is the Holborn before the Eric Parry extension, it was felt that the building was too small for two museum collections, which had two sets of trustees, two chairmen to compete with, and so on. And so a report was commissioned to see what should happen to the Craft Study Centre, and it was decided, quite understandably, either it or the Holborn should go somewhere else, and various options were proposed. And the winning option was the University of the Creative Arts, as it now is, in Farnham in Surrey, and that's a shot of the displays there. It's a tiny space they have there, but it's well cared for and well loved. My frustration is that no other city I can think of would allow a collection like that to go unchallenged. Any city, even if it didn't have the Holborn or the Roman Baths, would fight to acquire such a collection, let alone keep hold of it when it already had it for the last 25 years, 23 years. And it's that frustration that that I think, as I started, maybe made me want to talk about modern art in Bath, because we have this fantastic 18th century Georgian Regency heritage in Bath. And of course we should value it and preserve it and celebrate it and promote it internationally, but it shouldn't allow us not to see the value in other things. And I don't think, I can't help feeling that the obsession with the Georgian heritage and conservation around that time, 25 years ago, must have informed that tragic loss to the city, which can never be recovered. If that wasn't enough, I then remember my first job after I graduated from the University of Edinburgh was driving a van for a rather second-rate art mover based in Edinburgh. And I had this sort of vague memory of going to a photography gallery in Bath, the only time I'd been to Bath before, in that last millennium, apart from the Bernard Leach visit. And then I realised that the Royal Photographic Society, the greatest collection of early photography in the country, was in what's now the Botanics cocktail bar in the Octagon off Milsom Street. A phenomenal collection, which was established in Bath in 1980. I think there may be people who know much more about this than I do, but I believe as a private organisation, the RPS was entitled to sell the collection, and they did. But again, why the hell didn't the city throw themselves in front of the trucks leaving with the collection when it went to Bradford, to the Museum of Photography, Film and Television, which has now been, that collection's been dissolved in Bradford, and it's now sort of lost in the huge ocean of photography at the V&A. I mean, it does feature prominently in their new photography galleries, but it could have been, particularly in Bath, which was a sort of epicentre for early photographic practice, not just with Fox Talbot in Laycott, but with others. These are just some examples of some of the masterpieces of early photography that are in the collection by Julia Margaret Cameron and Roger Fenton and Stieglitz and so on. So two great cultural institutions representing key aspects of modern visual culture that our city allowed to disappear, I fear, because of a sort of narrow perception of what feels appropriate and important in Bath. My third frustration is this man, Hugh Blaker. Hugh Blaker was my predecessor. He was curator of the Holborn from 1905 to 1913, that is before it moved into its current building. So it was just around the corner in the old bank building on Charlotte Street. Blaker was an art historian, connoisseur and a collector, highly opinionated. Sort of get that, don't you, from the picture? And he was one of the early champions of post-impressionism in Britain. So when the first post-impressionist exhibition, Manet and the Post-Impressionists, was staged in London in 1910 by Roger Fry, supported by the rest of the Bloomsbury group, Blaker was writing to the Times saying the National Gallery has to acquire work by Cézanne and others. He did nothing about that at the Holborn. Instead, he saw it as his role to disattribute most of the paintings in the Holborn collection. He brought down the conservator from the National Gallery, and they went through the 260 odd paintings in the Holborn collection, decided there were, I think it was about 23 that were good, a great swathe of them which are quite good, and about more than half were bad. He insisted that the Leonardo was not a Leonardo, and so on, until he frustrated the trustees so much that they got rid of him. At the same time, as I say, he was a great champion of what was still contemporary practice in Paris, and he was advising the Davis sisters in Wales, the daughters of the mining family, who built the most astonishing collection that is now famously at the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff, largely built under his guidance. In fact, when Cecily Davis, I think, bought her first Cézanne in 1918, Blaker was able to say, thank God for that, I've been trying to persuade her since 1910 to get one. And under Blaker's auspices, he did stage an exhibition in Bath from their collection. He was himself a wonderful collector, and his collection was sold at the Leicester Galleries shortly after he died in the 1930s. This is one of the 4 Modiglianis that he owned. He had a huge collection of British modern contemporary art, as it was, Camden Town and so on, but also the post-impressionists and artists like Modigliani. It's a beautiful collection. And as I say, he advised the Davis sisters on their collecting. And in 1913, he negotiated with the Victoria Art Gallery to show a selection from an exhibition of their collection, which had been shown at the museum in Cardiff. Obviously, it still resided with them at home. And so he was thanked when he left the Holborn and left Bath for bringing a show, for staging a show that had introduced to Bath. And in particular, it's interesting the Bath Society of Artists record their gratitude for him introducing the artist work they would never have seen by artists like Millet, Monet. These are works from the Davis collection. This is, weirdly, this view of Charing Cross Bridge was called Westminster Bridge, but it is the right painting. And Renoir. As I say, because the sisters had only really started collecting more progressive art like these Renoir and Monets around 1910. So in 1913, it only formed a part of their collection. But as we know, they went on to do extraordinary things. So I have, for the last 7 years, cursed Hugh Blaker, because the Holborn was founded actually some years before the Tate Gallery. And it never crossed Blaker's mind to champion or acquire for the Holborn the works that he was promoting elsewhere. Whereas at the Tate, it never crossed anyone's mind to simply think, well, this is the collection of Henry Tate, and that's where we leave it. I cursed Blaker for not being more innovative and adventurous in his approach to curating. And then I read his kind of journals around the time he was leaving. And he records trying to persuade, I think it's the Victoria Art Gallery, in fact, not to acquire one work, but to acquire something more progressive. I think it's a Monet. And of course they don't, they go stick to their guns. And his sort of attitude in the journals is basically, oh, Bath, what can you do? So I suppose rather than cursing him, I had to sort of sympathize with him with that same frustration that we were seeing at the end of the 20th century was still there at the beginning of it. But anyway, moving on to modern art in Bath. Of course, one of the towering figures was Walter Sickert. And Sickert was, in British art terms, the conduit to those great French Impressionists. He claimed actually to be friends with Degas, Monet, and Manet. I think he might have overstated his case, but he was certainly close to Degas, and spent a lot of time, famously in Paris and Dieppe and in Venice, painting scenes in a way that was reminiscent of Degas' kind of through the keyhole approach to artistic composition and framing. And then during the First World War, he came to Bath and fell in love with the place. I have to say, I don't think his Bath paintings are the most adventurous things that he made, but they are very beautiful. There are two here of Pulteney Bridge and of the Assembly Rooms. And I guess it was because of that experience and his response to the city that he decided to come back here in the late 1930s and settled in Bathampton at St George's Hill House, the top of Bathampton Lane, with the younger artist Therese Lesaur. So this is his last years. So actually he was not as old as you think. I think he was in his late 70s, though he portrayed himself certainly as incredibly decrepit. And his work became much, much looser in these last years. This is the view of Abbey Yard from just the early months of the war. And he died in Bathampton in 1942, leaving Therese Lesaur. But it's important to note also that Sickert had a number of significant pupils who worked in Bath. One, Sylvia Goss. We have a lovely collection of her drawings of Bath in the Holborn collection. There's a beautiful view of Stall Street. And then Therese Lesaur herself, Sickert's last partner, who was a beautiful painter, she was a student of his. It looks rather washed out in this light. It is a very sort of gentle painting of a female, possibly it's a self-portrait, at work. Certainly the setting is St George's Hill House, where she and Sickert lived. they were very close to Clifford and Rosemary Ellis, who had come to Bath in 1936, and then in 1937 Clifford became principal of the Bath Academy of Art. It was through that friendship. I mean, actually, Ellis was so close to Sickert that it was him that they called on when Sickert needed kind of lifting up out of his chair or off the floor or whatever the situation was. And so shortly after Sickert had died, famously, Therese Lesaur offered the Ellises the use of St George's Hill House when the art school, Bath Academy of Art, was bombed in April 1942. So one of the things I discovered doing this actually is that Clifford Ellis was born in Bognor Regis, which is very near where I was born and grew up. And I can't imagine there's another artist who's ever come out of Bognor. And a weird coincidence, Hugh Blaker of the arrogant-looking cap was born in Worthing, just along the coast. So there are two key figures in modern art in Bath who were born on the Sussex coast. Bizarre and irrelevant coincidence. So the Ellises, moved the Bath School of Art initially actually into Sydney Place, where I visited in the 90s, and then to Sickert and Lesaur's house in Bathampton until some years after the war. Thinking of great artists in Bath, there of course have been many great artists visiting Bath because of the nature of the city, but ironically, one of the most significant, I think, was not for that reason, was John Piper, who came, I think, the day after the bombing raids in April 1942 to record the damage. Piper was already an official war artist, and the war artist scheme was run by Kenneth Clark, the director of the National Gallery, who had a great gift and a sort of, actually a kind of theory about art patronage, in which is based on his knowledge of Renaissance, I think, in which the patron is a sort of active partner in good patronage and commissions artists to make work appropriate to their strengths. And he recognized that sort of Piper's instinctive romanticism made him particularly suitable for painting ruins. He had painted one or two sort of ruined barns and crumbly churches before the war. But it was Clark who realized that Piper would become an extraordinary recorder of bomb damage, and he'd been working in Bristol already when Bath was bombed, and so he was dispatched here straight away. So the ruins were still smoking when he was here, and he very movingly wrote to his friend John Betchman saying it was the saddest day of his life to see this beautiful architecture decimated like that. So this is Somerset Place on the left, which ironically later became the home of Bath Academy of Art. And then also here, All Saints Chapel, close by, which was never rebuilt, I think. Everyone knows more about this than I do, I suspect. So, but I just wanted to note that, of course, there is, when we think about modern art in Bath, there are these instances of sort of significant visitors recording the place, as Sickert did in the First World War. And I suppose it's worth saying, probably would have been better saying it right at the beginning, that it's sort of, there's a sort of oddity when it's hard to narrate a kind of coherent history of art in Bath. But then I don't think that's an oddity. Why would one city have a particular sort of history of art that you could sort of tie into a sort of a sensible narrative, if you like? I mean, of course, cities are small places relative to the history of art. All cities, all places, hopefully, will rely on artists and creativity to have a kind of rich living culture. But that doesn't mean that there is necessarily going to be a sort of a coherent history that could be told in the same way that a national story of art might be told. And I guess in the modern period, we might question whether even that is sort of sustainable. So again, that's why, my history is episodic. Not simply because I'm not sure what the gaps are that I'm leaving, but also that there's no reason why those gaps shouldn't be there necessarily. Bath obviously stayed with Piper because he returned to the idea in the 1960s with this fabric design, the Stones of Bath, where you can, I've been trying to find the Holborn, I don't think it's there, but you can see the arches, I think, of Pulteney Bridge. think it was made for Sanderson's. So yes, so one of the oddities about the history of art in Bath, as John said at the beginning, is that it didn't really happen in Bath. In the post-war period, because of the Clifford Ellis's approach to Bath Academy of Art, Bath Academy attracted some of the most important painters for the next 2 generations in the post-war period. You see him appointing really major figures. And I think one of the key things about this is worth remembering in the current climate is that in the 1950s, very few artists could live on their art alone. You know, Ben Nicholson was possibly the most significant avant-garde artist of his generation. He was born in 1894. He didn't actually live from his art until the 1950s, and he's at retirement age. There was a great crisis in his life at the beginning of the Second World War because his father cut off his allowance. He was 46. So most artists had to teach to make a living, which enabled Ellis to attract some of the most important figures in contemporary British practice. So these 3 characters were the heads of department in the 1950s. William Scott, one of the most important painters of the time, James Tower, one of the most progressive potters, and then Kenneth Armitage, one of the leading figures in what was called the Geometry of Fear generation of sculptors, a generation of sculptors who followed the success of Henry Moore, and to celebrate that was shown as a group at the 1952 Venice Biennale, where the critic Herbert Reed just talked about their work in terms of the geometry of fear. It's a sort of classic existential reading of sculpture that sort of used mostly welded iron rather than cast bronze or sort of very weathered plasterwork. This was just how this was made, to create figurative or works in which sort of animal and human features sort of combine. So these were the heads of department, and having these major figures of contemporary art, of course, made Bath an incredibly attractive place to come as a student, but also attracted many other artists. And the part of the structure of the teaching at Bath Academy of Art was that artists would come for short periods of time, for maybe a few weeks, maybe to lecture, or on a regular basis for a year or something. And so you could get really important figures. It was, as I think I mentioned earlier, housed at Corsham Court, so in Wiltshire, in fact, rather than in Bath, and it remained there until the 1980s. In fact, I expect you all know that one of the oddities is that it must have been the Bath Academy of Art got themselves tied up into the most awful contract, which means that Bath Spa are still at Corsham Court, though I'm not sure they really want to be. I was told that, I think he's the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research and something else, has written in his contract that he's responsible for ensuring the health and well-being of the peacocks at Corsham Court. I don't think there are any other Pro-Vice Chancellors in the country who have that in their job description. So you see coming to Bath Academy some of the most important figures of the 1950s. In painting, on the left, Peter Lanyon, who Sandra mentioned, and this is a painting of his called Corsham Summer. It's a human figure, a shrouded figure, and it's also a sort of landscape painting, but sort of Lanyon approached landscape painting as if experienced over time, and also through history. So his paintings, though essentially abstract, are kind of figurative and kind of layered with ideas of myth and tradition. Brian Winter, who also, all 3 of these artists were primarily based around St Ives in Cornwall, which was in the 1950s as important a place for painting as London was. Brian Winter lived on the moors and painted these long gestural abstract paintings. I mean, the gestures are long, the paintings aren't so long, which are very close to contemporary French practice, but also recall the landscape in which he lived, where he lived on the moors, where the gorse was burnt off every winter, and the heather would grow through the blackened gorse bushes. So you see that in the purple and black colouring. And then Terry Frost, who had shifted from a sort of social realist kind of figurative painting to an abstraction based on kind of sublime landscapes, so sunsets and the sun and moon became sort of things he idolised. And again, this is a series of kind of moonlit compositions he made while at Corsham. It's worth noting, I think, that one of the attractions of Corsham for these guys was that it was an escape from the domestic sphere, shall we say. So all three of those men left wives and small children in Cornwall when they came up to Wiltshire to teach. Actually, I don't know about Terry Frost, but certainly Lanyon and Winter, this is the 1950s, remember, behaved very badly with the students. Well, I don't know whether it's bad. I mean, Brian Winter's second wife was one of his students at Corsham, and Lanyon, I think in the end, got the sack for carrying on with so many female students. One of the figures who's featured often when people tell the history of Corsham in this post-war period is this woman, Marie-Christine Trénon, who, even though she was only 22, 23 when she came to Corsham, she had moved as a young woman, I mean, her sort of late teens, in avant-garde circles in Paris, and is credited as bringing to Britain knowledge of the artist Jean de Buffet, who became a sensation later in the 50s. And this work of hers reflects that sort of awareness of de Buffet. De Buffet sort of made heavy paintings, figurative, but sort of based on graffiti. And sort of a kind of untutored, kind of what would have been seen as primitive art at the time. I think she's also reflecting the work of Bernard Buffet, who was very in vogue in Paris in that post-war period. And her work, these sort of chunky figures and spindly legs, you can see directly affecting an artist like Kenneth Armitage on the right. She ended up a potter, incidentally, and was working until she died in Valoris in the south of France, the pottery town made famous because it's where Picasso went to make his pots and left two amazing murals of War and Peace in a small chapel there. So in thinking about the sort of history of art in modern art in Bath, and particularly focusing on inevitably Corsham and the Bath Academy of Art plays a huge role in this because it's that, institution that attracts big names. It's also interesting to see sometimes the students who pass through as well. I was struck by Donald Locke, who was born in British Guiana in 1930, who came to Britain to go to Bath Academy of Art and to study with James Tower, the head of pottery I just mentioned, in the late 1950s. Donald Locke is having a revival. So he studied in Bath, he then moved on to Edinburgh, where he continued his studies, and then went back to Guyana and then ended his days in Atlanta, Georgia. But I think, I might have to flip backwards and forwards, but interestingly, this is a photograph I took at Frieze Masters Art Fair last week. So there was a whole stand given over to Donald Locke, as I say, who's having a moment. In fact, I was very keen to make a show of his work, though most of it's in Georgia, which is a bit of a challenge, but discovered that he's about to have a show next year at Spike Island in Bristol. So we abandoned that plan. But it's interesting to see what an artist who's trained with ceramics can then do with that medium in a more sculptural and frankly more sexual way. But if you look at that form at the back, that vase with the sort of, that looks like a kind of upper torso with a head and sort of, cavity where the head might be, and then look at the James Tower in the middle, his tutor, you can see, I think, even though they're many decades apart, the lingering influence. And if anyone reads the art reviews, you would have seen in today's papers rave reviews of Donald Locke's son, Hugh Locke's new installation at the British Museum. It's got 5 stars for what it's worth in many of the papers. So Bath Academy of Art continued to attract major figures, both as tutors and as students. Around 1960, the beginning of the 60s, one of the painting tutors was Robin Denny, who was just emerging as one of the leading painters, young painters in London, the most extreme of the sort of hard-edged abstract painters, responding to American painting of that time before many people had seen it in this country. This is a big painting. I mean, it's longer than this chimney breast in reality. So incredibly bold thing to be making in 1960. I know from my research on Peter Lanyon that, you know, in the 1950s and into the 60s, his dealers were writing to him saying, can't you sell paintings that we can sell? These are way too big, because they were over 4 foot wide. You know, this is a time when American painting was as wide as this room, if you think of Jackson Pollock or Barnett Newman. So Robin Denny, extremely committed and uncompromising an artist, became a tutor at Bath, and he attracted a sort of a group of artists around him, not least his wife Anna Teasdale, who's been sadly neglected as Denny went on to huge success. He had a major Tate retrospective in the early 70s when he was only just about 40, but he had left Anna, his wife, and she remained here. She, as you can see, I think, from that photograph on the left from 1962, she was a kind of pop artist at that time, painting her friends, but also political figures, and then later became a landscape painter. She lived in Bath Easton, and this is a view from Salisbury Hill. She also painted beautiful views of Salisbury Hill. So I wanted to include her in this because the group of artists around Denny, who became a really important nexus and represented working in this area, they were some of the leading artists of that time, of the late 1960s and early 70s. So Richard Smith, who also had a major Tate retrospective in his early 40s, again, one of the most groundbreaking painters in this country, who sort of bridged the gap between abstract painting and pop art, and he painted abstract paintings that were based not on landscape or on the human figure, but on advertising and corporate logos, and so on. And then he expanded into 3 dimensions. He famously made a whole series of paintings based on cigarette packets. And from that, he began to make these paintings that he called kites, that are simply sort of stretched canvases, I mean, loosely stretched like kites, suspended often on the wall, but also in space. So this is a work which we showed a couple of years ago. I think there's someone who saw it, when just after COVID, the Holborn was running the gallery at the Edge at the university. This each of these blue squares is like 6'6" square, so it's enormous. It's like 10 meters long. It's a single work. The most ambitious, I mean, it's interesting that his estate still owns it 50 years later, but the most uncompromisingly ambitious painting. So Dick Smith and his wife, Betsy, who messaged me on Instagram last night saying, make sure you talk about Dick Smith in your talk. Maybe she's watching. Settled for a short time in the Royal Crescent, and then they ended up moving into an old schoolhouse in just east of Chippenham. And close to them were Joe and Joss Tilson. So Joe Tilson was a part of the sort of pop art movement, older than David Hockney and the others, but still part of that movement. And then when he moved to the country at the end of the 60s, he trained as a carpenter, and he started making these constructions that sort of play with abstract art, but also reference kind of different traditions, rural traditions, pagan imagery, and also kind of more functional kind of references. He died fairly recently, this year, I think. And then perhaps most famous of this group of artists was Peter Blake, who settled in Wellow, south of Bath, with his then wife Jan Harwood, the American brought up in California, both figures in the pop art movement in London. They moved down here at the end of the 60s, and Blake moved into this sort of kind of new, sort of more romantic style, and joined with a number of other artists to form a group called the Brotherhood of Ruralists, who celebrated their their rural surroundings. Some of them lived in Devon and elsewhere. They weren't necessarily neighbours, but also looked to a kind of whimsical English tradition. So Alice in Wonderland features frequently in their work. I always think of this period as because some of Blake's Brotherhood of Ruralists images appeared on the Shakespeare editions I had at school for O-level and A-level. And then Jan Harworth, she made figures during the 60s that were made of sort of soft material. So they were like kind of stuffed dolls, really, but of sort of popular imagery, cowboys and surfer dudes and famous people. She did a rather creepy tableau of John Betjeman having tea with teddy bears, playing off his sort of tweeness. And then she moved on to making this calendula's cloak, which sort of references sort of, again, the sort of slightly sort of pagan traditional remedies and a sort of witch-like paganism. They separated, and Blake went back to London, but Jan stayed in Wellow well into the 90s, I think. Actually, maybe she played a crucial part in that, what I was talking about at the beginning, because I think I'd known her for about 15 years when I came here, and I sort of messaged her to say I'm leaving the Tate to go to run the Holborn Museum in Bath. You've probably never heard of it. And she's, oh my God, it's my favourite museum in the world. I love Robin Tanner's craft collection. I was like, yeah, well, they gave that away. So Blake and Harworth in Wellow, and then finally in this group, Howard Hodgkin, who had studied at Corsham in the 1950s and then came back as a tutor in the 1960s and settled, just outside Castle Combe, towards Chippenham in an old mill there, and sort of created this sort of pseudo-French rural life of sort of pastis in the morning and so on. He made these sort of amazing kind of semi-abstract paintings through the 60s. One of two of which I think are actually themed around the staff meeting at Corsham. And then a whole series of portraits or double portraits, which are sort of really allusions to figures in their interiors. They're often referenced by their setting rather than their identities. So the painting on the right is a portrait of Robin and Anna Denny, but it's called Widcombe Crescent, which is where they were living, and where these artists all tended to come and gather. There's an interesting kind of sense of community that comes out of that. So Betsy Smith is always keeps saying to me, you've got to do an exhibition of these artists at the Holborn. And apart from the fact that I say they won't fit, but you must include not just the artists, but the wives and their recipes. I don't know what the female artists would make of this. The wives and the recipes, because it was all part of this wonderful kind of creative social milieu of, sort of exotic foods and bohemian creativity. There's a really lovely picture, actually, of a sort of different kind of Britain in the 70s to the one that sort of we think of in the history. And slightly unexpectedly in the 60s, maybe off the back of Robin Denny's sort of austere painting, Bath Academy of Art became a centre for sort of constructivist abstraction. So you see here John Ernest on the left and Malcolm Hughes on the right, two artists who worked closely together and were teaching at Bath Academy of Art. And they're not unrelated to that, because this is a kind of conceptual approach to painting. It also became a centre for concrete poetry, so poetry in which is as much visual as it is literary, verbal, with artists like John Furnival and Dom Sylvester Houdard. It's a sort of aspect of the history that I was really unaware of until recently. I think it's when I realised that the Victoria Art Gallery has quite a significant collection of concrete poetry, which is very unexpected. It's almost as unexpected as seeing Ken Loach in Waitrose in Bath. I always find that really puzzling. Which before I worked here, I'd only been to Waitrose in Bath 2 or 3 times, and almost every time I saw Ken Loach. Anyway, and maybe off the back of that sort of engagement with this sort of more conceptual approach to art, Clifford Ellis employed a young Irish-born, American-trained artist, Michael Craig Martin, who's just got a huge show at the Royal Academy on at the moment, including this work. Despite having seen it on show last week, I couldn't find the title of it when I was putting this slideshow together. Anyway, it's a beautiful piece where he's just filled these milk bottles with water, so you get a perfect line across. It's a kind of more visually satisfying piece, I think, than his famous An Oak Tree, which is just a glass of water on a shelf, and then a text on the wall explaining why he's abandoned the random details of the oak tree. He's decided this work, this object, this glass of water is, to his mind, an oak tree. Anyway, I met Michael Craig Martin recently for the first time, and when I said what I did, he said that still, and he's in his 80s, Bath Academy of Art, and he's taught all over the world, Bath Academy of Art in the 60s remains the most innovative and challenging art school that he ever worked in, which is really an extraordinary tribute, I think, to what Clifford Ellis did in Bath and in Corsham. Thank you for that agreement. And so on. I should mention some painters who were also teaching at Bath Academy of Art around that time or shortly afterwards, and who are still practicing locally. On the left, an early Colin Crumplin, he and his partner Maria Lalich, the work on the right, still live in Bath and work in Corsham, and Michael Simpson in the middle, who we showed 110 of his drawings at the Holborn last year or this year, I've lost track of time, last year, which is really exciting. He's the most extraordinary kind of uncompromising artist. These paintings are enormous. I mean, he had a stand at Frieze last week of 3 paintings, and again, each one is, you know, at least as long as this chimney breast, or probably longer. Very sort of beautifully painted, but these very stripped back subjects, which are all based on certain images that he uses as a critique of Catholic tradition. So there's the squint, which normally has a ladder in it, which is the squint that allowed lepers to see the Eucharist but kept them out of the church, or the confessional, which he sees as as an atheist, he sees as an awful thing. So there were these amazing painters teaching at Bath Academy of Art in the 70s, and also an extraordinary sculptor, Michael Penny, who I think taught there for over 50 years. Sadly, when I arrived here, I did meet him a couple of times. Actually, I had one of the nicest encounters I've ever had. This sounds rather arrogant, but I just arrived at the Holborn, and my family was still in London, so evenings were sort of spent just sort of poring over our disastrous finances and trying to think of an answer and looking for something better to do. And I saw there was an opening at the Pound Art Centre in Corsham one evening, so I thought, well, as the local museum director, I should go to this. And it was a sort of amateur sculptor who'd made this one quite interesting work following a trip to Tibet, I think. Anyway, I'd been talking to him, and I'd missed the moment when I could say who I was and what I did. And then this other guy came along who was clearly a sculptor, and he said, "Oh, I'm Michael Penny. I used to be head of sculpture." And I said, "Oh, I'm Chris Stevens." And he said, "The Chris Stevens?" It's the high point of my life. It's only because I'd written a book on Henry Moore, but still, it was a very nice moment. Anyway, he was head of sculpture for many, many years at Corsham, at Bath, and extraordinary sculptors came out from under his tutelage. So I've just shown a small sample here on the left, Nicholas Pope. This is a work actually we showed at the Holborn a few years ago, just after the lockdown. One of a series he did of portraits of his marriage, spiked and hold, sort of, all marriages have ups and downs. And then on the bottom right, Peter Randall Page, who makes these beautiful carvings using patterns from nature, the sort of, I can't remember the word for the sort of the pattern of seeds in a sunflower head, for example. And then above that, though it looks similar but very different in origin, Veronica Ryan, who's a fantastic artist, who splits her time between London and Bristol at the moment, born in Montserrat in the Caribbean. And this is a commission she had as one of several memorials to the Windrush generation. And so they're large bronzes cast at Pangolin near Stroud of tropical fruits, or characteristic Caribbean fruit, sitting right in the centre of Hackney in East London. But one could go on. The wonderful artists have come out of a younger generation as well. But it wasn't always just Bath Academy of Art. I mean, it was mostly, but there was a moment, and there may be many people in this room who remember this, and certainly will know more about it than me, when there was a visual arts festival in Bath that attracted major international figures. It was run by a guy called Sean Kelly, who I know next to nothing about, except he still has a gallery in New York. And he had a little gallery called Art Site in Pierpont Place, where he showed artists like Yanis Kounelis, who was one of the leading figures in the sort of 1970s kind of conceptual art, not really conceptual art, but sort of installation art movement. So this is to explain, this is not a painting. The work of art here is the modelled head on the steel stand with the gas bottle in the background. So in 1987, Bath was dubbed Sculpture City, and there was a festival of sculpture across the centre of Bath with people like Nicholas Pope and Richard Deacon and others showing in Parade Gardens. Yanis Kounelis had a show both at the Art Site Gallery and at Walcott Chapel. David Mack, I wish I'd had a picture of this, because I saw this work when I was a student in Edinburgh, maybe the year before. He did this sort of sculpture out of old rubber tyres that looked like a submarine was just surfacing through the street. I mean, it's enormous, it's the size of this room. So it's life-size submarines coming out of the road, as it were. Did anyone see it?
It's ringing the bell, that's all I can say.
You might be thinking of farmyards with all those tyres piled over them. Anyway, and then it was followed in 1989 with a show of Rebecca Horn, who again is in this same movement, a sort of performative installation artist. She just died last week or the week before, in her 80s. So these major international, groundbreaking, cutting-edge artists were being brought to Bath through one person's kind of entrepreneurial spirit. And I think it's that, one wonders why that sort of didn't continue for longer, and whether there was an audience there that was receptive to what Sean Kelly was doing, whether he'd left because he just had something else to do. I don't know. It would be interesting to find out, because it certainly doesn't feel that there's very much like that at the moment. I mean, there are artists, good artists working in Bath. I mean, of course, there are many artists in Bath. And it's so important, I think, that any city has that sort of rich, creative life, not just visual artists, of course, but writers and performers and musicians and so on, and that we provide the infrastructure to support them, but also bring other art down to offer, kind of nourishment. No artist is going to flourish without having the nourishment of seeing other important art. I mean, I've followed, because of my history, art in St Ives, I suppose all my life, and when they opened the Tate there in the early 90s, I mean, it took a long time, but you can see that the art made in West Cornwall now is far more adventurous and more varied and more significant on a wider scale than it was at the time. At that time, there were lots of nice artists, but they were making sort of, either traditional landscapes of the sea or sort of paintings like those guys from the 50s that I showed earlier. And it's that presence of important art, showing artists what other artists are doing, that is so important if you want to nurture a sort of really rich artistic sort of centre of creativity, and of course the infrastructure to support them, the studios and the gallery spaces. Anyway, I've shown two artists who I think are really interesting in Bath at the moment. Nicola Turner, who's recently sort of taken on an old Formica factory in sort of between Oldfield Park and Twerton, was Cosmo Fry's factory, and turned it into a block of studios. And she works there, and this is a piece on the left that she made this summer for the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy. It was a commission from the RA. It's a response to the famous statue of Joshua Reynolds in the front. She works using sheep's fleece, a lot of sheep. And then also in that studio block is Simon Perroton, who was one of the generation of artists who sort of came to prominence in the 1990s, sort of parallel to the YBAs, Damien Hirst and Tracy Emin and so on. He sort of made his name making kind of giant doilies, so cut out forms that in paper that then would sort of have all sorts of strange kind of sexual punk imagery in it. This is a commission he did for the British Council in the embassy in Brussels, where he sort of, looks like the lattice work of the window has blown out. I don't know how he got away with that, thinking about it. An embassy sounds very dodgy, doesn't it? I think part of my motivation at the Holborn, and I'm just finishing now, is to think about, bringing important art to Bath, and that will be the art of the past, of Holbein and Gainsborough and Turner next summer, Henry Moore or Gwen John, but it should also be, contemporary artists, both to open up a dialogue with our collection and our historic site, both the building and the city perhaps, but also to help, encourage and nurture artists in the city, and to support them. We can't necessarily support them through exhibitions, and God knows we can't give them money, but we can at least, bring other artists' work down. So these are two works. One on the right, you may have spotted, is on the building at the moment. This is by Shaila Singh Burman, canopy of, I can't remember the title of it. Anyway, they're two big trees in neon that are a wonderful celebration of sort of rich nature, which, given the weather outside, I find incredibly comforting every morning when I go past and every evening when I leave. And then a work we showed when I was quite new there by Graham Fagan called A Slave's Lament, which I felt we needed to respond to the history of that was embodied in the portraits in our picture gallery and is also part of the Holborn own history of colonialism and specifically to sort of the wealth derived from enslaved labour. And this is an extraordinary piece, a 4-screen video, for which Fagan had found the Slave's Lament, a poem by Robbie Burns, who nearly went to work on a plantation in the Caribbean. And he set the piece to music, or he commissioned a composer to set it to music with 3 instruments and a human voice, and he had the 3 string instruments. And then this wonderful reggae singer, Ghetto Priest, it was an incredibly moving lament, even if you were in the office next door and had it 8 hours a day for 3 months. It remained incredibly moving and powerful. That's why we do what we're doing, to use contemporary art and contemporary artists to open up the historic collection and to help maintain its relevance, to show how it still resonates with our present moment, but also to talk to contemporary artists. Wasn't that bad, Marion? To encourage and enrich contemporary artist practice, so that Bath might again, if it's not already, be a place where artists want to live and make their work. Thank you.
So, you ready for a little Q&A?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
If there are any.
There you are, it's on. Are there any questions?
Yes, I've got a comment rather than a
Oh
question.
no.
Thank you. Hello, Chris. Can you hear me? Yes. I was thinking how we miss the Royal Photographic Society's set up in Milsom Street. We used to go a lot, and there we had, I don't know if other people remember it, we had David Hockney's photo work when he first came out with his Polaroid pictures. Wow. And, the real thing weren't photocopies of the photocopies. And so we had that. I can't remember whether Hockney came to it. I don't think so. I think he was in California. But there was a huge exhibition and very attractive. And then within a few weeks, we had Linda McCartney's photographs and himself. Paul McCartney came, and all he said, because he was just milling around, And he just kept saying, "This is Linda's evening," you know. He wouldn't take any part because people were trying to get him, you know, to pose in front of pictures of him or, you know, with Linda or something. He kept saying, "No, no, forget me. It's Linda's night." It was really lovely. It was a really lovely remembrance. So I hadn't thought about the Photographic Society from practically then until now. It's nice to be reminded.
Well, thank you for that.
Bristol, I'm afraid.
Well, you know,
Another question?
it wasn't really a question. As I said, it was a comment.
Thank you, that was really interesting.
No, thank you.
I'm in Bath because of the Craft Study Centre. So my dad was a acquisitions trustee, and my earliest memories of Bath are coming to the Holborn and Menstrie, which was called at the time. And there was an amazing cupboard at the back, absolutely stuffed full of pots that you had to make an appointment to go and see. And
can you hold the microphone up?
Dad's died now, but your words of what a tragedy that the Craft Study Centre went to Farnham, that was Dad's mantra until he died. And I've been to the Craft Study Centre in Farnham because I took some of Dad's pots there when he died. And it's tiny, and it's just nothing that it ought to be for the weight that it punches in the ceramics community. And I wonder whether or not, as part of your exhibition programme, if you would have an exhibition representing what the Craft Study Centre was. And
yes,
what
it was funny you
about.
should say that, because it was in my mind that 2027 will be the 50th anniversary of, that's right, isn't it, 77? Yeah, of its opening at the Holborn. And before I could do anything, the new director there had got in touch to say, you know, be interested to make contact. And so we might do something.
Question?
Yes, there's one down here.
Shy audience.
Chris, thank you so much. It was so interesting and such a wide range. And I think perhaps it would be nice to recognize your role in maintaining a modern art interest in Bath, because you do a lot to do that. I think I wanted to ask you about attitudes to art in Bath. You talked about specific works, but not much, a little about attitudes. Have things changed? Do you feel that Bath is a more open city today than it was 25 years ago? Do you think it's going to become better and more open towards contemporary art? I remember I practically cried when that craft exhibition left Bath. Anyway, I just wanted your comments on that.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think, I don't know, I'm not sure I feel capable of commenting on attitudes in Bath. I don't even live here now, and I certainly didn't live here then. But I mean, I would have thought, there was a moment in the 70s, it seems to me, that there was certainly an ambition. I mean, certainly from our point of view at the Holborn, in the 70s, with the Holborn had just been taken in by the University of Bath. And, you know, that was the context in which the Craft Study Centre came to that place. And during the first part of the 70s at least, if not going on a bit longer, there were a series of sort of very outline proposals for a major extension at the back of the building. I've certainly seen it appear somewhere where it is designated Museum of Modern Art behind the Holborn. And they came to nothing. And I think that's possibly because then in the 80s, the university started sort of possibly regretting the level of their commitment because they were paying for everything. And, you know, so from the Holborn's point of view, I think that was the sort of formative. But I mean, I do sense that there was a moment in the 80s that ran into the 90s where heritage, not just in Bath, nationally became such an important overriding thing. But I think, you know, I've said this before, so I don't feel I'm speaking out of turn, that it is interesting that Baines Council has a head of heritage services as opposed to a head of culture, which is what that post would be called in most cities. And so understandably, their role has been perceived as looking after the heritage that the council's in charge of, rather than supporting cultural activity more widely. But I think there is now, so I feel quite optimistic, apart from the fact that the whole funding landscape in the country is a disaster. But in Bath, I feel more positive about that, because I think the council, both the officers and the politicians, recognise more clearly now than when I arrived 7 years ago the value of culture. And they talk about, they're not going to put any money into it, but they talk about supporting other organisations than just their own. I mean, I had a conversation with someone at the council a few years ago, retired now, who said, he'd been talking to one of the other small museums who, talked about the importance they brought to Bath. He said, but we all know it's the Roman baths, and the rest is just decoration, or something like that. And I think, that's why, the Fashion Museum was, never realised its full potential, and has now got to find a new home. But hopefully that will serve as a kind of an engine for, the whole city and for all of us to get on. Because I think, obviously millions of people come to Bath to visit and to live because of its beautiful heritage. But both the visitors and inhabitants then need a living culture. Otherwise you just become a museum. So, and that's not just visual arts, obviously it's theatre and music venues and so on. So that's avoided your question while filling 5 minutes.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah.
I was struck by the last image of the work that you obviously love on the facade.
Yes.
And I live very close to it and look at it with great interest. But one of the things that has struck me about that work is that it is drawing the eye towards the museum and arousing curiosity about the building in a way that in the past wouldn't have been allowed with sheer publicity. You couldn't have put a huge sign in neon saying Holborn Museum.
Couldn't you? No.
Well, I believe it's not allowed on a building of
quite.
that kind, but you've put an artwork which can be seen from miles away. I wondered what had inspired you and whether you understand its marketing potential.
Well, yes, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's bothered me is that when I arrived at the Holborn, several people said, but the problem you've got is that you're too far out of town. I lived in London, so it seemed like a ludicrous thing to say. But I completely understand what they meant, and for visitors, certainly you see Pulteney Bridge and you go to Laura Place and you look down the street and it's wonderful, but you've no idea what that place at the end is. And we changed the banners that were outside to make them brighter, and you still can't see what it says on them. And there was interesting, there are photographs, I'm not sure when they're from, I think probably just post-war, where there's a big banner saying exhibition hanging on the balcony to show what goes on there. So I have been thinking about how one animates the front of or the site, at least, to make people think, well, they might not know it's the Holborn Museum, but they can see that it's sort of interesting and maybe a creative place. And it's a park as well, so the trees are perfect.
Well, I've got a question. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Well, I can.
Yeah? No. Anyway, my question is, what have you got in store for us coming up now at the Holborn? You've got the wonderful Goya and...
We've got Pularego and Goya at the moment, and
trial
Shiloh.
evening, you've got Nick Willing showing his documentary.
Yeah, so Nick Willing, who's a filmmaker, who's Pularego's son, is coming tomorrow night, showing his film about his mother, in which I think for the first time she talked about her depression and mental health problems, and how it informed her art. Exhibition-wise, in January, we've got a show called Iconic, which is sort of artists using photography and portraiture, mostly in the 50s and 60s. Francis Bacon, Andy Warhol, people like that, David Hockney. And two young artists, Diedrich Brackens, who's a Texan from Los Angeles, but Joshua Donker, who's about 26, from Oldfield Park, who we showed when we were at the Edge. He's a really lovely young painter. And then in the summer, we're showing the most amazing collection of watercolours, Turner. Next year is Turner's 250th anniversary, as well as Jane Austen's. So we're showing this great collection of Turner and his contemporaries in watercolour.
Whatever happened to the Edge? Because that was wonderful, that space.
The gallery, well, it was very difficult to run because there were no visitors. I mean, no one would travel there, and even the students, wouldn't come. I mean, can't blame them. I remember being at Tate Britain when Chelsea School of Art was moving next door, and everyone was so excited. There are going to be 10,000 art students on our doorstep. They never came in. Some of them sometimes came for, one of the tutors had seminars in this cafe, and they might go to the Turner Prize. So, a university that doesn't have a humanities school, we can't blame the students for not coming to the art gallery. But the university wanted the space for something else. So actually, that just reminds me, because I was about to say the positive thing about us being thrown out at the Edge was that the university helped fund our last exhibition, which we showed at the Assembly Rooms spring last year, about Unlimited, which was a project run by Jeremy Fry to make unlimited editions of artists by leading cutting-edge figures, which absolutely should have been in my talk. I'm really sorry, I don't know how I didn't include it.
Well, they've got a Peter Rendell Page. He was the guest artist at the Victoria Gallery right now at the Bath Society of Artists.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Feature there of his work.
Oh, wow.
Some of his
He's lovely.
sculpture and some of his
Yeah.
paintings. Anyway, it just remains for me to say thank you, and John, and I thank you very much for coming. And it's been a fantastic talk. And let's try to
Very
get
kind.
that artistic spirit back into Bath.